So thank you everyone for coming today to our lab talk number 7. My name is Samuel Choi. I am an SDR at Cluster Market. So I talk with scientific facilities to see if we'd be a good fit and we can help them in their lab. Today's lab talk is about navigating collaboration in a post-pandemic lab. So the coronavirus pandemic changed the nature of collaboration in all industries. And of course, scientific research is one of them. Scientists could previously work together in one lab without restrictions. And once COVID hit, these restrictions have been in place. So it affected the dynamic and forced the lab to adopt new methods. While the restrictions may now be decreasing, now remote technologies will stay with scientists, and will this stay with scientists, and will the future change, or will keep this type of methodology moving forward? So I have 3 panelists today joining me, Rory McNeil, Michaela Eng, and Alex Goldberg. I will do a quick intro of them. Rory is the CEO of ResearchSpace, which provides the RSpace ELN, and he also hosts the Fair Data podcast. In both roles, he's able to focus on its main interest, which is developing better support for data and sample management. ResearchSpace integrates with many other software that manage data that are out in the market, and it will have an integration with Cluster Market launching in the next few weeks. Michaela is currently a 3rd-year PhD candidate in a basic science lab at McMaster University in Canada. She started her PhD in January 2020, so she has become well-versed in navigating scientific research in the midst of a pandemic. And finally, Alex is a former postdoc who worked in tuberous sclerosis complex and cancer research. He now works as a medical writer in medical education for pharmaceutical industry. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining me today. And to get things started, I would just like to ask, how did you or your customers used to collaborate in science labs? You can mention tools that they use, benefits that they had, and maybe some drawbacks that they had before. Anyone that wants to take the floor first?
I'll start off. So when in a pre-pandemic world, collaboration was everything. All the new labs here, they're all set up to promote collaboration. It's very open concept. All the labs have a lot of common space. But that really changed once the pandemic hit, because like you mentioned, we can no longer have more than a certain number of people in a certain area at a single time. So before, we used to have a lot of, our journal clubs, they were all in person. We'd have 20 people in a room and have snacks. And it was really a time not just for collaborative learning, but also for socialization, which is something that can be kind of difficult when you're all working on your own projects. So even in terms of like social collaboration and stuff like that, that's really changed since the pandemic started as well.
Okay, just as a follow-up question, you mentioned that not only collaboration for the work environment, but also as a social activity. How important is within a lab to have strong social bonds within the members of the lab?
That's what makes or breaks somebody's experience in a lab, somebody's career in a lab. Having a good bond and a good network within your labs and within labs adjacent to you as well is super important, especially as a grad student. Sometimes stuff sucks and things are hard, and having that network to be able to lean on is really helpful for getting you through those trying times. And I feel that since we haven't had things in person as much, everyone has become a little bit more individualized. I don't want to say recluse, but definitely more individualized, because we don't have those opportunities to come together as a lab. And it affects the, I want to say vibe in the building as well. Because before it was just like it was a fun place to be for the most part, but now it's kind of like you go in, you do your stuff, you leave. That's it.
Yeah, I can see that. Alex, any comments?
I feel like there's like a generational gap there. It's kind of funny because if you think about like an old school mentality, and maybe it's more prevalent in the United States, like both me and Michaela are from Canada. And I think maybe we have some big labs, like McGill has big labs and U of T and things like that. But if you go, the Ivy League schools in the US, and maybe I think there's a little bit more of an old school mentality where it's not necessarily as close together. There's a lot more competition to succeed. It's not as tightly knit. And I feel like there's potentially, because of social media, because of just how relaxed the younger generation is, like how relaxed we are nowadays, that it used to be a lot more tightly knit than potentially like before. And now it's almost like if there was a generation that could overcome COVID, it's us based on social media and how tightly knit we are, Like there's definitely some sort of, there's like not a resolution, but almost just like a natural affinity to communicating with other people and to making it a fun place nowadays in the lab, which is a little bit taken away. But I still think, I haven't had the chance to actually work in the lab post-pandemic, but I do have a lot of pre-pandemic experience. And I can imagine that based on all of the social networks that we have now and how easy it is to communicate, that there's never been a time where it's easier to keep that up until, which it seems like, that the restrictions are all coming to an end, at least in many parts of the US and some parts of Canada.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that having the pandemic made it created a growth within the communication? Like, is it more necessary to be more communicative with your peers because of COVID and because of all these restrictions, physical restrictions?
I can say, based on, the work that I do now is purely at home. It's all remote work that I do, and I can say that it's forced people to, and not just for labs, but just overall, like in any company that you work for, any institution, it's forced people to relearn how to manage to a certain extent, and it's forced people to become a lot more involved. Like if there's an issue that's brought up, it gets brought up immediately. Whereas if you meet somebody in the lab, or if you meet somebody at work and you think, okay, like there's an issue, I'm going to talk to the lab meeting, or I'm going to talk to my supervisor when I see them, that kind of thing. Those issues are brought up immediately on the spot now, by email, by text message on Teams, any of those platforms, because you need to. If you don't, then things always go by the wayside. You put it to the side and you never end up meeting the person, right? Like there's no formal meeting with that person. So I think the speed of which management occurs is much faster and much more efficient now, because they need to be, and if they don't, then they can't really manage people well. Like you can't really communicate with people well. You can't assess your logistics. You can't figure out what needs to be done if you don't do it faster.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you're saying that it changed a mentality in us, that we want to get things done faster and right at that moment when when you realize something.
Yeah.
So that would be a pro, I would say, right? From the pandemic, and how our mentality has changed in that matter. Yeah. Rory, any insights about how things used to be before the pandemic for you?
Yeah, well, just no, maybe not an insight, but just a reflection on what Alex was saying about the different kinds of labs. There's obviously a spectrum between large labs and small labs, and also between my observation is some labs are really a collection of individuals, and others actually work as a group. And so probably in the smaller labs, there's more of a tendency to be able to work as a group, whereas in some of the super labs you mentioned down in places like Harvard or MIT, if you've got a rock star PI and 30 or 40 or 50 people in the lab, then the relationship tends to be more each person to the PI. So there's not a lot of cross communication. So I suspect in those kind of labs, in that sense, the pandemic probably hit hit less hard because there was less communication, kind of horizontal communication to deal with. But in Michaela's example, where it was more fun and there was a lot more going on and it was more social, then that would be that would hit harder. That makes sense to me. Yeah.
I would actually disagree with that. I would actually think, just based from a management perspective, that a smaller lab would have a easier time keeping up the communication once the pandemic hit. They probably even had an easier time with getting people in the lab and, you know, working out schedules, whereas a larger lab, just working out the schedules for who's going to do what work. And this all comes down to the PI, right? Like all of those decisions come down to the PI. If somebody gets sick, guess whose responsibility that is? It kind of comes down to the PI who's managing all of those people. So, and especially if they have, you know, oops, like 10 people came in when they weren't supposed to, and now all of them are sick, then that management decision it all rests on that PI. And there's so many people in that lab. I feel like it actually makes it even harder. Like it was hard enough to communicate. I think the pandemic would have actually made that even harder for him to manage that kind of role, because it's another responsibility on top of everything else he's already working with. Nonstop grant writing and, you know, working like 80-hour weeks, you know? So I don't know. I think smaller knit labs, they would actually, they wouldn't necessarily benefit. I think with the COVID pandemic, it's not necessarily a matter of benefiting. It's a matter of who loses less ability to communicate. And I think the smaller labs probably lost less ability. They probably lost less because it's just easier to manage like 5 people versus 50.
Yeah, I would totally agree. Like, you both have good points. That I think from a work perspective, it was easier for our lab because we are quite a small lab. So having people decide, like, I only have to text 3 people to decide who's going to come in on what days and, you know, at what times, versus I guess a larger lab. But definitely I feel that because we are a smaller lab, we are a lot more tight knit. That's also the nature of the studies that we do in our lab. So they involve many people to make a single study work. So in that term, it made it more difficult because those studies can occur because, for instance, our studies take place over 72 hours and we have to do something every 4 hours for 72 hours straight. So that involves us sleeping over at the lab. You can't really put that many people together and especially try to sleep in the lab when you have severe restrictions. So it made our work a little bit more difficult in terms of some of the studies that we were trying to do. But I also think we were a little bit harder hit in the social aspect because we are very tight knit, because there are so few of us. Like in my lab, we're particularly small. We have 3 grad students and a medical fellow. So there's only 4 of us in our PI. We have a lot of labs that we're also close with around us. It's like a conglomerate of smaller labs that make one big unit. And we were all very close. Like I said, doing things like journal club. We did like happy hours on Thursdays in the lab, and now those things don't exist. And it definitely had an impact, like kind of on the morale around, because we work so close together and we are so collaborative that we really help lift each other up and help each other complete each other's work, which isn't as possible now.
So smaller labs were used to the social aspect being more interconnected, and all of that now is lost, right? So maybe you were hit harder on that side, but it was easier to organize during the pandemic, whereas bigger labs, they might have not had that close-knit relationship, but in order to organize such a large number of users, it would have been more complicated, right? So mentioning the organization around the lab and when someone would come in to run their experiments, what technologies have you been using, or what new methods did you have to adopt since the start of the pandemic?
We have so many group chats. We have group chats for every different project. We have group chats for, you know, different groups of students, different labs. We utilize WhatsApp the most here. And that I would say would be the most direct method of communication. We have like group chats with our PIs, with like me, there's another PhD student in our PI. We have like direct communication with each other, which I actually think is a bit more of a benefit. Like Alex was kind of mentioning, like we go straight to our PI when we need something because she's just a text away. Versus before, I was like, oh, well, is she in today? Is she coming in today? So it's definitely a lot more direct. And sometimes that can be a good thing and a bad thing. When people are messaging you at 4 o'clock in the morning, it's not a great thing.
Yeah, definitely. So, do you feel like some of these barriers that were in place before are gone now because of this? You're using WhatsApp right now, so this helps communication and lower these barriers with your PI, for example.
Yeah, I definitely think that the WhatsApp is, and a lot of people that are using those electronic lab notebooks where their PIs have access to them. So that's also a good thing, a bad thing, because your PI can see how much or how little you're doing. But it's different than having to take your paper notebook into their office and wait for them to come in and show them, you know, your little pieces of paper with your results on them or your little pictures of your little blots. Like those electronic notebooks have really helped improve that communication as well.
Come on, just 2 seconds.
Alex, yeah.
I'm just gonna stop my video and I'm gonna mute myself. I'm getting a call from a project manager at work. I'm gonna have to just take a small break. All right, I'll be back.
Yeah, no problem.
So Sam, then maybe I can just jump in there. So in terms of what's changed, and actually it's too bad Alex is, I guess he's still here, he's just muted, but so it's interesting. So, I mean, it seems to me that some things in the lab definitely became more difficult after the pandemic, and obviously scheduling equipment is probably the classic example of that, because as Michaela was saying, you have limited number of people coming in when they can come in, so therefore equipment scheduling becomes a lot more fraught and less relaxed than it was before. And it was interesting when as you mentioned, we're about to release an integration between the RSpace ELN and Cluster Market. And when we started investigating, it just so happens that the first lab that I reached out to was quite a large lab. They have, I think, about 40 people. And when I said, you know, would an integration with an equipment scheduling app be useful? I got, and this is a busy PI, I got an email back like 5 seconds later saying, yes, please, we needed it yesterday. And clearly that was stimulated by some of the restrictions that they were facing because of the pandemic. So I think that that in terms that those are kind of you know, very lab work related tools, as opposed to something, a communication tool like WhatsApp. And I think another aspect of that is the integration between tools. It's great to move from doing things on paper to doing things electronically, whether that's an ELN or an equipment scheduling tool. But if all the tools don't work together, that's not so convenient either. So if you can actually get them working, if they're integrated and working as a group, then that actually is even another level of kind of a communication platform in effect, and also to Alex's point, a management or organizational platform. So I think all those things have been dramatically accelerated by the pandemic.
Yeah. Maybe there was some reluctance from the PIs or lab managers to adopt new technology, right? They like their paper notebooks, they like having their calendars in paper printed out and stuck on the instrument. But now things changed, so they quickly had to adapt, right? So following up on this, Rory, you might have some insights with the clients you work with. Was there a specific need or a growth in need or requests from your clients of different software that you know of since the pandemic?
Yes. I mean, well, first of all, we've just noticed a huge increase in our business generally. So clearly people are going electronic. So that's the case. But also, and coming back to my point about the benefit of integrations, what people wanting things to work together. So I mentioned I could give you quite a few examples, but Cluster Market is one. But another one, which we've done recently, is a tool called PIRAT. It's an animal colony management system. And again, it's used to manage colonies of animals, and typically those things are standalone tools. But now they want to be able to work with them as they work with as their general experimental data in an electronic lab notebook. And if you think about it, it's also a benefit to also be able to aggregate data from the equipment that was used. Sample management is another tool. So people are, I think, beginning to look for integrated solutions to kind of broader and more ambitious workflows, as the point is, just try this, and then put them together.
Yeah, I would definitely say like integrating everything into one, because I'd say right now we don't have a very good integration platform. We actually do still have some machines that are on a paper calendar that you book out. But we also have like apps for everything. Our phone is just loaded with different apps for different softwares, like our colony management software, which is great because then it's great to have on my phone because then I get notifications when my mice need to be weaned or if the vet has flagged one of my cages. But then I have that software. I have my WhatsApp. I have my electronic notebook. I have this, and having them all in different places can be a little overwhelming sometimes. I open up the wrong apps, and especially when I'm trying to show somebody something, that's always the moment where you can never pull up the thing that you need. So yeah, I can definitely see the need for like integration of like different platforms.
Just to pick up on another point. Sorry.
Go ahead, Rory. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, picking up on another point, which is kind of implicit in some of the things that Michaela has been saying about, on my phone. I think something else that's been accelerated by the pandemic. It was happening anyway, but probably the pandemic did accelerate it. Was the need for things to be accessible on mobile devices as well. And not that people don't use their desktops or their laptops, of course they do, but oftentimes they're moving around, whether it's moving around in the lab or moving around outside the lab, or maybe they're sleeping somewhere in the lab and they need to get their text at 3 a.m. But the ability to quickly access information through the mobile device, I think that's another trend which has been accelerated by the pandemic.
And piggyback riding on that idea and Michaela's idea, I think there is maybe some technical debt, some need to improve because the market adopted all of these technologies so quick, right? Within a couple months, everyone was looking for a digital way to solve their problems that they could do it in a manual fashion. So I feel like sometimes the companies or the technology is not up to date, up to par of what the client wants, because there wasn't that big demand before, right? Could you share some light into this, Rory?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, and there wasn't demand, I guess. Well, I mean, I think, well, let's face it, everyone's set in their ways. And when things have been done in a certain way, and of course there are generational issues as well, but even outside of generational issues, it doesn't take people very long to get set in whatever way it is that they're set. And so it's something like this forced people, as you said, overnight to kind of rethink everything in the beginning, if you think back, it was a crisis, not a crisis mentality. It was a crisis because you couldn't even go into the lab for a while, and then you were able to in a restricted way. And it was, but so yes, I think that's right. And then there's a bit of time to figure out, well, what are potential solutions? And then I think you also see a huge amount of innovation among the researchers who are using tools, and also among tools providers, because they see, well, there's a need, but there's also an opportunity here to do the research more effectively, or to make your tool more widely adopted by making it, what people want in this new context. So, I think it's been quite an exciting, it's been difficult, but there's also been an exciting period. And I think even now, but certainly in 2 to 3 years, we'll come out the other side thinking, my God, how did people even manage 5 years ago? They were so kind of primitive in what they did. I don't know, Michaela, what do you think? Do you think that's right? Or
I absolutely think that's right. Because even there's some things that I was like, why weren't we doing this sooner? Why, like, even just for some of our like equipment booking, we just use Google Calendar, I think, for some of it. And I'm like, why weren't we doing this sooner? Because previously when we're on the little paper calendars, like I'd have to go to the lab to go book it out. And then if I didn't make it, or if I had something else come up, then I'd have to go to the lab and scratch my name off the paper. So why was that ever a thing? Why weren't we using these different integration platforms earlier where we could integrate, first of all, that we weren't having a different Google Calendar for every different piece of equipment that we had and a different login account, but also like, it's just so much more simple now that I wonder why we didn't move there sooner.
So just a reflection. What are some of the benefits or drawbacks of the new way of working post-pandemic? Or what do you think, Michaela, that you are every day in the lab?
So definitely one of the biggest, I'd say, pros to the pandemic is online conferences. Now I get to go to so many conferences, attend so many talks that I would never be able to attend before because we didn't have the funds to travel to the UK or travel to other places in Europe. So those types of things have been huge in personal growth as well as networking. That's definitely been amazing. Definitely some of the drawbacks are that lack of community that I think that we've kind of adopted. And definitely there's been some setbacks for each individual because, for instance, I wasn't allowed to go into the lab for 9 months. The first 9 months of my PhD, I sat at home and read papers. So now we're trying to like make up for that time and trying to find those efficiencies, those softwares that will help us, you know, instead of copy and pasting our stuff into Excel, what kind of programs can we use to kind of, you know, get it all in one place for better data management and better data analysis. So those are definitely trying to find those efficiencies or have those efficiencies have definitely been a amazing pro in the past like year since we've been back to being a little bit more freely into lab and doing experiments for sure.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing. I think that the big, or certainly one of the biggest pluses is the ability to communicate with people who aren't in your location. And I, like Michaela, I kind of have OD'd on online conferences, and there's been a couple afternoons where I'm trying to attend 3 at once, and I at the end of the day I said, why am I doing this to myself? But because you know, it's like you know, your eyes are bigger than your stomach. You know, you just think, oh, I can do that, I can do this. But you know, fantastic opportunities to network, to understand, to meet with people online, anywhere, without any constraint except time zones, and that's been a huge plus, I think. And with, you know, with collaborators, with partners, with customers, you name it. And also, I think I'd be interested, Michaela, let me ask you, because my feeling is, this just occurred to me as we were discussing it, but that some of the online conferences have actually become more open and kind of productive and creative because of this this infusion of new blood, so to speak. And I think there may be, when I think in the past some of the in-person conferences were quite top-down. They're very structured. You know, this is how it is. People give talks. People come to listen. There's a great interaction outside the formal presentations, and people meet and network and have fun. That's all good. But in terms of actual substantive interaction, say with the presenters, it tended to be quite unidirectional. Whereas my impression is now that, at least the ones I attend, it's often more, there's more give and take, and there's more kind of ability to contribute if you're not necessarily the presenter, which to me, that's actually a really positive trend as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree that a lot of them do like these little breakout groups as well. So then you actually have time to go and talk to the presenter, the keynote speaker, that sometimes you wouldn't before. And also it's more comfortable for a lot of people, and they get more out of it because it's a lot harder to approach somebody in person, I think, especially when you're trying to talk, like there's this amazing keynote speaker and, you really admire the work that they do, but they're this really keynote speaker and you don't really want to like walk up to them and be like, hi, I'm a PhD student. But so being able to have that, a little bit more arm's length approach, but still being able to talk to them directly has definitely been making the conferences more worthwhile to attend. And also I think that there's been it's more diverse, the types of people that attend the conferences. So for instance, I've been attending some innate or humoral immunity talks when I do innate immunity. So I get to learn and benefit from what they're doing, which otherwise my PI would have normally not spent the money for me to go to a conference on something that's not directly my field. So I get to learn some of the things and some of the approaches that they're doing in their field to be able to apply to my own work. It's the same with, a lot of people are moving to multi-omics approaches. So being able to go to, let's say, a proteomics conference when, again, my PI normally wouldn't send me to that because it's not my direct field, but I go there, I learn a bunch of stuff, a bunch of new techniques that I can then apply to my own. It's going to make my research way more rich, way more impactful than I probably would have never had that opportunity prior to these online conferences.
Yeah. Is it okay if I ask Michaela a question? Yeah.
Go ahead.
This is
Go ahead, Rory.
I was thinking about when you mentioned what triggered this question really was your point about how do you learn, how you can learn new things. So another new technology which isn't really related to the pandemic, but it's certainly become even more prominent in the last couple of years is video and YouTube. And to what extent do you try to learn things related to your research techniques, whatever, through YouTube, or is that not something you use for that? Do you use it for other things?
No. Normally, when I'm trying to learn a new concept, I will go to YouTube first and try to find like a very simplified version.
Right.
So then, because if you try to go straight to the literature, sometimes it can be very overwhelming. It's very complex. There's a lot of jargon. So I actually use YouTube a lot to try and learn new learn new techniques before I'm trying to research them, or even learn new techniques. For instance, like when I'm doing a new mouse technique, being able to see it visually versus just reading it off a protocol on a piece of paper makes it so much quicker to adapt that new protocol or adapt that new technique, as well as again, going back to the conferences, a lot of them, they're now recorded and put on YouTube. So instead of trying to watch 3 at once, I'll watch 2 at once and then I'll go watch the 3rd one later when it's posted on YouTube. So definitely YouTube has been an amazing resource for me and my learning, for sure.
Just as a follow-up question, I guess, did you ever expect, tapping into YouTube for academic purposes?
Probably not to the extent that I'm currently using it for. I also never thought that there'd be some of like the very niche techniques or niche areas of research that I'd be able to find so much information on them, like, different molecular pathways. There's all these great videos with these great animations that, as someone who's a visual learner, I can learn things so much quicker, retain so much more through YouTube, where previously I would have thought that YouTube's just for wasting a lot of time watching videos of nonsense.
So a follow-up of this, what other unexpected things happened while you were, adapting to this new way of working, for both Rory and Michaela, whoever wants to take it first?
Yeah, okay, let me jump in. Definitely the online conference we've discussed, and the ability to the positive ability to just before I come on to that, or just, it's interesting. I've now noticed that some of the conferences are beginning to be in person again, or not, kind of starting in summer and then maybe looking towards the autumn. And one clear thing is they're more expensive than the online conferences. And I'm trying to think about organizing a panel for a couple of conferences. And I'm thinking, well, gee, I don't know if the people are going to be able to find funding to and the time to go to this panel, whereas before I wouldn't have even thought about that. They would have just said, of course, it's $50 or yeah, no problem. But if it's $1,000 or $2,000 and plus the hotel, then all of a sudden they need to get approval and it's a lot more difficult. So so I think we're going to also have to transition back and get used to some of the old ways of doing things. But anyway, yeah, in terms of unexpected things, I mean, I think how you work with the people you're working with is something you need to be a bit more self-conscious about. So like, we have a great group, a fantastic team that I've been working with. Well, there's some new people, but some are been there for a while. And I appreciated them a lot before, but I think I appreciate them more now. And I think, ironically, I'm actually more sensitive to kind of each individual's their life outside work kind of thing. Not that, again, I don't think I was particularly insensitive before, but I've certainly become both more appreciative and more aware of kind of the human dynamic, possibly because there's less, there's less of the direct human dynamic than there was before. And if you don't become a bit more sensitive and you don't see people that often, you can actually lose touch more easily with their situation. And that's not a good thing if you're trying to work together. So perhaps that's one unexpected thing, which again, I think in my case, and I assume many others, has been turned from a problem into hopefully a positive thing.
Yeah, piggybacking on that, being on the flip side of it. So I definitely find that my PI or any of like the PIs or people above me, they seem a lot more empathetic, especially when you're not quite hitting deadlines that you would normally hit, because there's a lot of things going on in the world that can be very distracting, and or your family member caught COVID and you're trying to go to the grocery store to make sure that they have all the things that they need, and that's taking away time from the work that you could be doing. And the fact that now that a lot of it's work from home, there's that little bit of a lack of separation between work and home, that I find that a lot of uppers are being like, make sure that you take the weekend off, make sure you take some time for yourself. Before, they'd be like, why aren't you working on the weekends? Why aren't you working Saturday at 10 p.m.? Like, I definitely find that there is a lot more, I think, empathy and compassion coming from some of the uppers that have come out of this situation.
Glad to have you back, Alex. Any comments on this? What unexpected things have happened while we were adapting to the new ways?
Well, at least with regards to the lab, it's kind of hard to, like, I'm coming from a perspective, since I never got a chance to actually formally work in a lab during the pandemic. So I'm kind of coming from a perspective from all of my experiences are pre-pandemic, but I definitely echo what Michaela said in terms of the pressures that you felt pre-pandemic to work on weekends, to really, everything was very, usually very strict with regards to deadlines, with regards to getting enough work done. There was a lot of stress about publishing, a lot of stress about where the next grant would come from. It's actually kind of funny, because you would think with the COVID pandemic that funds might even be harder to come by now, because of all of the money that the government's put into helping people survive through the pandemic, everything that's going on with the world right now, including the war in Ukraine. Financial institutions are straining to a certain extent, as well as governments. You would think that it's even harder to publish and harder to get funding. I don't necessarily know. This is kind of like speculation on my part, just based on the events of what's transpiring across the globe. But at the same time, people seem to be, at least from what I've heard, people, even at my own work, everybody's very sympathetic and empathetic towards any sort of situation. It's almost like a release of pressure. It's almost like when you have nothing, you have everything. That kind of thing, When you finally are homeless, you feel like you're free. So it's almost kind of that situation that everybody's been put in, that everybody's in the same boat, everybody's struggling. So the stress is almost gone, because you're not constantly putting yourself up against that competition throughout the pandemic. You can kind of almost relax a little bit, even though you know that results are going to be down the opportunities for funding are going to be down, but you kind of persevere.
Yeah, that's a good idea that you mentioned, that having less maybe sometimes is liberating, and not having that pressure. I just want to change gears a little bit and talk about communication. So now that we've improved communication after the pandemic via using different technologies such as WhatsApp or other software that help us communicate with our colleagues, what can we do now moving forward to make sure that that good communication remains moving forward with our colleagues and peers?
I would start by saying, like, definitely continuing those integrations of different softwares, because sometimes there are communications within softwares such as our colony management, where I connect with the vets and the vet tech, and they're able to send me direct messages that, you know, again, like one of my cages were flagged. But then I have like a separate app for that. And then I have a separate app for my PIs. So definitely having that integration of, like, you open up one thing and you see all your messages in one place. It's basically like having an email, but then again, you have your emails in another app as well. So I definitely think having them all being integrated into one place, one cohesive place, will definitely help improve communications. There'll be a lot less, oh, sorry, I didn't see that notification on that app because I had this app open, or, you know, I didn't check my emails because I didn't get everything through WhatsApp. So definitely having everything in one place would definitely continue to improve that communication amongst different places, like the animal facility versus the labs itself versus when I'm at home.
I think to that point, I think RFID, the implementation of RFID would actually be great to kind of help everything connect, especially for collaborations where if you're labeling samples either by hand or by barcodes, it's not necessarily like barcodes have their own standardization, that's fine, but everybody kind of uses their own system, right? Everybody uses their own kind of different barcode to label samples, and it kind of becomes a mess. I think RFID, in terms of just standardizing things throughout different labs and throughout different institutions, it helps things connect one thing to the other, you know? It helps labs connect all of their results together and makes analysis a lot easier in the long run.
Rory, any insights about standardizations of protocols for better communication? Because like Alex said, every vendor, every software maker tries to push their own platform and their own way to do things. Could there be a standardization sometime in the near future, to make things easier for everyone, even ELN software, right?
Yeah, well, it's clearly a big challenge. So certainly our major focus is on integrations, and I think you think of integrations, or I think of it kind of at two levels. There's the data level, so you can pass information about equipment scheduling to the ELN and vice versa, or the animal colony management system. So there's that kind of top level of communication, and it is possible to automate some of that. But there's maybe, just to throw in another idea, there's something else which is just beginning to happen, but I think it will become important, which is permanent identifiers. So permanent identifiers are a kind of metadata, a metadata structure, if you will. And it's really very early days, but to let permanent identifiers to be associated with particular data sets, again, to pass easily between tools that are used in the research cycle, and then to automate that process, which then facilitates search. Again, this isn't exactly communication, but it is communication of a kind. Search for information about experiments, about samples, about other things. So I think that in the next 5 years, the permanent identifiers are going to become an important tool, which will largely operate behind the scenes, which are going to facilitate discovery, which in itself will also be a boon to communication, I think.
Do you have any experience in terms of labs using those permanent identifiers, or what kind of challenges What kind of
Well,
challenges? Just
Yeah, I
curious.
think it's not a matter of labs using them. They need to be built into the tool so that it just happens automatically. So if people have to figure out how to use them, it's not that kind of defeats the purpose.
But wouldn't it put
Um,
people at that
So
point?
an example that you're probably familiar with is ORCID IDs. I assume you're familiar with ORCID ID. So your ORCID ID follows you around, and if you post a data set or a publication, your ORCID ID is automatically associated with it. So that's an example of a particular kind of ID. And then there's also DataCite IDs, which are associated with data sets, so that when data sets which increasingly become research objects themselves, so that the ID is associated with the data set. There's a whole system so that, again, it's then possible to discover things more easily. So again, these things won't become really useful, or I think ORCID IDs are now very useful, but they've only become useful after there's been a lot of development of the concept and the implementation over 5 to 7 years. I think the same will be true of other types of permanent identifiers.
I think one of the challenges is to get everyone on board on the same level, right? Every software vendor, every lab has to say, okay, we like these standards, these work for us. Because what might work for me might not work for Michaela or for Alex or for you, Rory. So I think that's the biggest challenge, right?
Yeah.
So just another question for the people that might be listening in. What advice would you personally give to those that are maybe struggling a little bit with communication when they're working remotely or trying to learn or adapt to a new process that is been handed on from top down?
Play a game, play an online game. I
Okay.
know it sounds silly, but I've had experience. Michaela can vouch for me on this one. That we've had experience where even just between groups of friends who are busy, who, you know, it's difficult to really communicate all the time. Everybody has their own schedules, but I think something that is interactive, that's engaging, that you can get if you can't get everybody on board to play a simple game online, and there are a whole bunch of games that you can play online, if you can't organize like your lab to come do that, then how are you going to organize lab schedules? You know, like if you don't start at the base with something simple that people want to do, that people would generally enjoy just playing in their basement, then how can you possibly get them to be motivated enough to schedule themselves online to do things for the lab instead of just kind of, you know, especially with laboratory personnel, they're used to working on their own for much of the day, you know? So if you can't get them to communicate based on that, then how are you going to get them to communicate based on everything else? You know, you kind of have to almost like give them a little bit of a carrot, do something fun, do something that's not just that kind of builds character online with everybody, that builds like rapport online. That way, when things bubble up in work, it's much easier to communicate. There's already that line of communication that you guys start off fresh, that you guys are starting off with something fun on a personal level, that when something professional happens, well, you can still deal with it on a personal level and manage personalities from afar.
Any other tips, Michaela, Rory, from your experience?
From my experience, is just ask questions, ask everything, especially because when you have those opportunities, like for those, you know, times that we do have like our online Zoom meetings in the lab, and you have that time with your PI or your other peers that are a little bit more immediate, even more immediate than a text message, like ask those questions. Because now it's not as easy as walking over to somebody's cubicle and asking a question. They're not there because restrictions. So although, yes, we have even like a more direct line of communication with like your WhatsApp or your other systems that you're using, there's nothing better than asking the questions when you do have those, you know, small face-to-face moments, and being able to, like Alex said, like build that rapport. It's great to build rapports over text messages, but you can also say a lot of things over text messages that you wouldn't say to somebody's face. And that's also something that you really have to remember when you're working on those communications or you're communicating with other people and uppers, that you still have to maintain that level of professionalism. Well, yes, you can get to know them as a person and build those things as well, but it's still important to maintain those levels of hierarchy kind of, because nothing's worse than, you know, trying to overstep somebody and that causing a huge kerfuffle or, you know, causing a breakdown within the lab, because times are still, as much as we'd like to say we're post-pandemic, at least here in Canada, like we still do have a lot of restrictions within our research facility that might be more strict than like what's in the general public. So definitely just, you know, taking those times that you do get a little bit of face-to-face time and kind of valuing it a little bit more, because it's a little bit more rare.
And I guess we're all using more asynchronous tools for communication, right? WhatsApp, Slack, Teams, those are, you don't have to reply right at that time. You can wait a couple minutes, an hour if you're doing something else, right? So yeah, you're right. Maybe cherishing and valuing more face-to-face time is important for having that side of communication as well. Rory, any ideas for tips?
Yeah, I think what Alex and Michaela said makes sense, and kind of picking up on one of the earlier points about, which I try to do a bit more, is to try to you know, prepare in advance for important questions like YouTube. You know, in other words, educate yourself. You can often find out a lot of stuff, and therefore you can ask, if it's a question, you can ask a more informed question, as opposed to my instinct was just to blurt out questions and you know, bother people about stuff, which is not really a good practice. So I think I've become a bit more maybe disciplined about trying to learn for myself, and then you end up having more productive. Sometimes you can if you can avoid, if it's a kind of a meaningless or non-essential communication, you don't do it at all, which is good. Or if it's an important one, you end up having a more productive conversation. So sometimes that can be helpful as well, since there's so much information out there now on YouTube and elsewhere.
I must say that having virtual meetings has really helped. Like you can more easily access, if you want to research something in the middle of a talk or in the middle of a discussion, you can just be like, hold on, I'm gonna go look it up, you know. I've come across quite a few client meetings where you're just kind of like, you know, I'm not sure, hold on, give me just a second. Whereas in an actual meeting, like there's no way when you're, you know, you go to your PI's office or you're in the middle of a presentation, you can't do that kind of thing. It's helped quite a bit.
All right. Well, I would just like to kind of wrap things up. If anyone of our panelists has any closing comments they'd like to share, you're welcome to. If not, I'll just take lead. And I guess just as a quick summary, the pandemic has affected us all in different ways, but I think we are good and bad things out of this. Maybe the social aspect is one of the cons of having this pandemic hit us, but then we've adopted quickly different types of software for communication and collaboration within our places of work, scientific laboratories specifically. And I believe that there's still much to do, such as integrating with different softwares that we use, so we don't have 10 different apps for every single thing that we are working on, and as well as kind of wanting to have more social activities and more face-to-face communications with our peers. And maybe we should think of how to improve upon this and how to try to minimize the cons that it has brought into the world. So I'd like to thank everyone that has joined into the call, and this will be available on YouTube once we process the video, and we'll put it up. So as we mentioned, you can use it as a resource if you'd like to. And I would just like to thank very much our panelists, Alex, Michaela, and Rory for joining me. And that'd be it from our side. Thank you.